Greetings and salutations. It's me, Chris O. Cook. That's O period, not O apostrophe. Here to tell you how to write a good poem, or at least how to avoid writing a bad one. This is a beginner-level video aimed at people who are looking to avoid a few of the most common mistakes, the biggest and most important, in my opinion, common mistakes that people who are new to poetry tend to make. I'm glad that you're interested in poetry, and I don't wish to discourage anyone, but there are definitely some things that you want to avoid doing. And I've arranged 7 of those into a list that you can remember with the handy mnemonic device T.S. Eliot, in which each letter of the famous poet's name will stand for a piece of advice. So let's get started. T, the first T, is for therapy. The poem is not. When you write a poem, you are doing something for the reader. The reader's not doing something for you. When you go to a therapist, you pay the therapist. When someone buys your book of poetry, they are paying you. So if you want to write poems, in your diary or wherever just for you, that's fine. No one's telling you you can't do that, but don't expect people to like them. The poem itself may be about you, but the act of writing a poem is not. It's about the rest of the human race. Even though a poem may feel very personal, and much of the best poetry is, of course, intensely and actually very personal, what you are primarily doing when you write a poem is not about you. What you are primarily doing is creating an object of art, just like the director of a movie or the painter of a painting. That means, quite simply, you are making something for other people. They're not doing something for you. You are, as a poet, someone who is offering a gift, not someone who is asking to be indulged. The material, the content can be as personal as you want, but as far as what the poem's job is, always remember that it is for other people, not for you. So keep that in mind. S is for secrets. Don't keep them. A poem is not a puzzle that the reader has to figure out. One of the most common mistakes early on is people intentionally leaving out information in order to create an air of mystery or complexity. But good poems, great poems, are never more complex than they need to be. They can feel that way in school, especially if it's an older poem and maybe the language is not what you're used to. But believe it or not, those poets are not deliberately making things complex. They're writing about complex subjects in the most straightforward way possible. If there were another way to say it, then they would have said that instead. A poem is not actually designed to be a secret code that the reader has to figure out. It can feel that way in school, especially when you know you're going to have to write a paper about the poem that you're going to be graded on, but that's school's fault. I'll be talking more about school a bit later on. If you have to leave out things right and left to make the poem interesting, then the poem is not really interesting. And the impulse to do that shows that you're still thinking of the poem as being you, when the poem is not you. The poem is the poem. A poem is not a puzzle that you have to figure out. Life is a puzzle that you have to figure out, and the poem is a clue. The poem is there to help. E is for experience. Doesn't matter. And when I say experience doesn't matter, I don't mean that practice or training doesn't matter. Those things matter a lot. I mean that your personal life experience is not the primary issue at hand. whenever someone's poem gets criticized in a beginner workshop, 9 times out of 10, the first words out of the writer's mouth are, well, this really happened. This really happened to me. Okay, fine, but I cannot stress this enough. It does not matter whether it really happened. I'm sorry. The fact that something really happened is no excuse for a bad poem. When we critique your poem, we're not denying that it happened or saying that we don't believe you. We're saying, write a good poem about what happened instead of a bad one. I don't mean to say that you should ignore the truth. I believe, on general principle, that a poem should not lie, but that doesn't mean that a poem's primary duty is to present a factual account of something. And who says a poem even has to present a narrative or concern a series of events at all? A poem can do those things, certainly, but it's not about content, it's about language. It's about the way that language is being used. What happened can inform that, certainly, but the bottom line is, if you want to write content, if you want to write accounts of events, then write prose, write stories. Because a poem is about the words it uses. It's about the way you put things, not the things. The poem is not your experience is your experience, and the poem is a series of words on a piece of paper designed to be read by someone who doesn't know you and has no reason to care about you aside from how well done the words on that piece of paper are. They may think they do. People may read, say, Daddy by Sylvia Plath and think, oh, this poor woman had this terrible childhood, I'm so moved by that. But they're not. That's not what they're moved by. They're moved by how skillfully done the poem is. If it were about the same experiences, but it was a bad poem, they'd be making fun of it. That sounds cold, but thinking of it that way, acknowledging that this is how things are, is the only way to improve. Just like a song played by someone who can't sing and can't play their instrument, is just noise, regardless of what it's about. A poem by someone who can't write is a bad poem, no matter what it's about. So. Okay, L is for lines. They are a thing. Possibly the biggest thing that I guess rubs me the wrong way about beginner poetry is their disregard for, or I guess ignorance of, the concept of the line. They'll just write 2 or 3 word lines kind of vertically down the page with no regard for how they're broken, because I guess a beginner thinks, okay, well, that's what a poem is supposed to look like. That's how you know it's a poem when you look at it. I guess that's the same reason people do things like center spacing, which is another bad idea, by the way. You submit to a journal a poem that's center spaced, and center spaced equals right in the garbage, so don't do that either. But lines. Okay, speech, prose, language, the rest of the time is written in sentences. Poetry is written in lines. The unit of poetry is not the sentence, it's the line. Poems can also, of course, contain sentences, but you need to be thinking of lines as the things. Poetry isn't written in lines just so people can still tell it's a poem, even if they, don't have their glasses on or whatever. Poetry is written in lines because a line of poetry is its own piece of art within the larger piece of art, just like how one person in a painting with a lot of people in it is kind of its own painting. Like how Cameron in Ferris Bueller's Day Off is looking at the Seurat painting, and his consciousness zooms in, and for him, eventually the whole painting becomes about the face of that little girl who's holding hands with her mom. Now, each line in a poem potentially it has the same power, or is supposed to. It's its own thing. So, have a reason why it breaks, why it ends where it does. If you're writing in metrics, you may think you have your answer, okay, a certain number of syllables, but in any poem, even a metric one, you don't just pay attention to syllables, you also retain a consciousness of the line as a thing. Syllables is not an excuse. In any good poem, every line is its own thing, and how it feels at the end informs the next line. There are different types of line breaks. Like if you break a line somewhere where someone would naturally pause, like at a comma or a period or before a conjunction, that's called a soft break. Conversely, if you break a line somewhere where you wouldn't normally pause, like between an adjective and a noun, or between a noun and its verb, that's called a hard break. And they feel different. Why would you do one type of line break in one place and another in another place? Well, maybe you're rhyming, but trying to hide the rhyme so it doesn't sound as cheesy, and hard breaks hide rhyme, whereas soft breaks accentuate rhyme. So be thinking about things like that. Why you're breaking your lines, where you're breaking them. Why does it end at this word and go to the next line there, as opposed to the word before or the word after? And make sure that each line of poetry, even out of context, is its own little thing.